Right. So before we get started, I'll say a prayer and we'll get to it. It's good seeing you guys. Lord, we just thank you so much for this evening. We thank you for everybody that's here that could make it. Anybody watching online, we just pray that you're here among us, and that we absorb all these things as much as we can, so that we can hopefully use them one day to influence people for Jesus. And I just pray that you keep that on the forefront of our thoughts and our hearts. And I just pray that we have a good time of fellowship this evening. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Come on in, Jill. I have a couple more coming. All right. We got prayer. Any stories anybody wants to share about your week? Anything interesting? No? You guys live really exciting lives. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Oh, okay. You got something. You just don't know. God can use your obedience to make things happen. One thing Andy said earlier was that you said you were talking to a coworker, staff at your group, and she's not a believer, but she said something like, well, it's good to believe in something, right? And then you kind of say, well, what should I say? And I said, well, I think you should ask her why. Why is it good to believe in something? Because she probably never thought about it, right? And that could spark a conversation. So I thought that was kind of neat. Okay, so you guys ever exercise, like you go to the gym or you run or whatever, you need to stretch. Sometimes I feel like in these classes we need to mentally stretch a little bit because this is going to get a little heavy, okay? But it should be very interesting. Let's just really quickly, let's recap last week real quick. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Last week we talked about effective evangelism. We talked about stuff like people are at different places in their walk, right? So you have to meet people where they're at. We talked about how the times, the culture is different. So in order to reach people, our methods might look different, even though the message stays the same, right? We talked about the importance of building relationships, right? Because people don't tend to trust people they don't know very well, So we talked about, what did Jesus do? How did he approach ministry? And then we covered that acronym PLANT. Again, I was telling Andy, don't forget that acronym, because it seems like he might have somebody he's pursuing, but now he needs to learn about them and learn what they believe, why they believe it. We talked about gardening. We talked about things to avoid. And then we kind of just wrapped it up and we said, have you ever just tried being someone's friend? And because when you're a friend, they trust you and you can speak into their lives, but it might take a long time. So that was kind of last week. This week, now, see, we're going to go to slide 3. Okay, this week, now this is how it's pronounced, by the way. This is how it's pronounced. The teleological argument. Teleological. And then we're going to talk about what that means. This is the second argument we're going to go over for God's existence. We went over the cosmological already. And cosmological was showing that God exists by showing how the universe began to exist. Anybody have a stab or a guess at what the teleological argument is going to start pointing towards? Any guesses? The teleological argument is going to show that a designer must exist. So we're going to look at the design of the universe. Okay. The first one we talked about the beginning of the universe. Now we're going to talk about the design of the universe. Okay. And then after some class on tactics, we're finally going to cover the last argument for God, and that's the moral argument. So what is this? What does this mean? What does this word actually mean? Well, it's in your notes. The term teleological is derived from the Greek word telos. Okay, telos, which means end, goal, purpose, or completion. Okay, end, goal, purpose, or completion. And then you combine that with the logical part, which just means like reason or give an explanation. So we're giving an explanation of the purpose of the universe or design. Okay, this is what we call the argument for design. Okay, and the reason why we're not going to get deep into like evolution, which we can talk about, but we don't really need to, because this circumvents the whole thing. And what do I mean by that? So this supersedes any argument about evolution, because this goes back to the very beginning. Okay. Uh, this goes back to the beginning of the universe. Okay. And so anything that happens after that, we've already established that there has to be design. Okay. It shows that the universe has to have an intelligence from the start. All right. Yep. Andy. So it means it, gosh, I know what it means and I can't describe it. So it means it takes its place. It doesn't need to, it surpasses any kind of argument about evolution, because without this, you would have no evolution, even if it were true. So it just means it overshadows it, kind of. Okay. All right. So let's just talk about what this word means, because we're going to be using it a lot today. Fine tuning. What is fine tuning? When we say this, because we're going to say this a lot, that the universe is fine tuned for life. What do we mean by that? What do we mean fine tuned? Anybody know? Everything works according to everything. That's a good shot there. I like it. Precise. I like it. Okay. Yeah, that's a good one too. So I have this picture of this combination lock, right? Remember these? You have a dial there, 1 through, there's 39 numbers or whatever, and you got to spin it 3 different ways to open it, right? Well, basically fine tuning is the dials, right? The dials of the universe that set the universe in place are so precise that to deviate one way or the other would mean that there would be no life in the universe. But when we say fine-tuned, what we do not mean right now is design, because a lot of atheist scientists will use this term, or other people who aren't scientists, they'll say, yeah, the universe is fine-tuned, but they don't necessarily mean it was designed. And I'll get to that. They just mean that the dials are set. That's all they mean. There could be other reasons that they have why they're set that way. Okay. So this is actually a neutral term, fine-tuning. It describes the highly ordered state of the universe. Okay. But it doesn't necessarily mean design at this point. Make sense? Okay. So don't say things like, yeah, if you're in a conversation, don't say stuff like, well, the majority of scientists agree the universe is designed, because they don't. Okay. But what you could say is, yeah, the majority of scientists agree the universe is fine-tuned. They just might have a different reason why they think it's fine-tuned. Does that make sense? Okay. Think of it as this lock or dial, or this lock with the dial on it. In order to open this dial, that would allow the universe to have life. Instead of 39 numbers, you're talking about trillions upon trillions upon trillions of different combinations that could have been. Okay. And I just felt like it was good to play this. I'm going to play this 5-minute video like we did in the first class with the cosmological, because it's from the same ministry. And so they have another animated video, 5 minutes long, and it'll kind of prime you a little bit to what we're going to talk about. So let's just watch that. You catch all that? All right. So just give you a little taste. That way, when we go back and talk about some of these things, maybe it'll refresh your memory. So before we get to that argument, let's go over some terms that I think we all need to be on the same page about, because we're going to be using this word that's called plausible. On your sheet, there are 3 words and kind of a brief definition of them, but we need to know the difference between things that are possible, plausible, and probable. Okay. Those under terms to know. So possible, what does possible mean? Well, it means that it's technically possible. Like, I'm trying to think of something like something really, I should have had an example. So let's say I spill a box of alphabet cereal. I spill a box of alphabet cereal. It's technically possible that when I spill that box, it'll spell out, hey, Jesse, how's it going? I mean, that's possible, but is it plausible? Not plausible. Meaning there's nothing about it that can't happen. It's just very, very unlikely. So it's technically possible. But it's not impossible like a married bachelor is impossible because you can't, that's the contradiction. Or like a square triangle, that's a contradiction. It's not impossible. So a lot of things are technically possible, but we're not concerned about that. We want to know what's plausible. So plausible means seeming very reasonable or very possible, right? Uh, like it's okay. This is persuasive enough to accept. Okay, so it's more plausible that I got here to church in a car than an airplane. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, eh, we can make logical assumptions like that. So possible versus plausible, and then probable is more like, okay, it's most likely true, right? But we're not going to talk too much about probable. Just we're going to be using the word plausible. Okay, are things plausible? Let's go to the argument now. Just like we did with the first one, we broke it down by premises, right? Here's the premise one of the teleological argument. And if you don't want to call it teleological, that's fine. Sometimes I'll just call it the design argument. Okay. Premise one: the universe is fine-tuned to allow life to occur. Okay. Remember when we talked about an argument? If the premises are true and the conclusion follows, we have a sound argument. So the universe is fine-tuned to allow life to occur. Premise two: the fine-tuning of the universe is either due to necessity, chance, or design. We'll get into that. Premise three: the fine-tuning is not due to necessity or chance. Therefore, the fine-tuning is due to design. Okay, that's the formal argument. Okay, and then now, like we did in the first class, we're going to go through each of the premises and defend them. Okay, first premise: the universe is fine-tuned to allow life to occur. Well, how do we know this? How do we know the universe is fine-tuned to allow life? Well, this is going to look very familiar. I'm sure you're all going to know exactly what this means. I'm sure you know all these numbers and exactly what they mean, and I know this is elementary, really. I'm just kidding. I don't know what half of this stuff means. Okay. I just put it up there, and you don't have to know it either. I just put it up there because this is a brief list of some of the constants and quantities that they're talking about. Again, don't ask me to explain half of them because I don't know. There's a few that I can explain, but these are the kind of the numbers, and the idea is that a lot of these numbers, if not most of them, if they were varied a little bit either way, we wouldn't have life in this universe. Okay, so those are on your notes if you ever need them. I don't know that you'll ever need them, but the whole point of this is that there is an extremely narrow range of these constants that would allow life to occur. Okay, and real side note, let's say you go, Jesse, but I don't think that's how the universe worked. I don't think that's how God designed it. That's fine. You don't need to, because here's the thing. The reason why it's powerful is because you'll see in a little bit that atheists are admitting these things. And then you can go to that atheist and go, well, if you believe this is what follows, So even if you don't agree with the science behind it, doesn't matter, because it's very powerful either way. Okay. Just want to say that. But anyways, without these constants being the way they are, there would be no stars, no planets, no life, or even chemistry wouldn't exist. Okay. There'd be no chemistry at all. So let's talk about stuff that maybe one of these that we might understand better. And it was mentioned in the video. Let's talk about gravity. Okay. You all know what gravity is, right? Right. Gravity. Oh, let me get that. Anyways, so gravity. If gravity were altered, and what I mean by gravity, I mean the force of gravity, like how strong it pulls. If it were altered in one part in 10 to the 60, which 10 to the 60 is 1 with 60 zeros after it, that there would be no life anywhere in the universe. Now, how big is this number? Well, the video briefly mentioned that the number of cells in our body is 10 to the 14, which is 100 trillion. Okay. 10 to the 14 cells is one with 14 zeros after it. That's 100 trillion cells in our body. Okay, that's a lot. But the force of gravity, if it were altered by 1 in 10 to the 60, That's a lot bigger number. So what's 1 in 10 to the 60? That's 1 in 10 to the 60. 1 with 60 zeros after it. A number that you can't even fathom. Okay? And keep in mind, this is just one constant. If any of the constants were tweaked by one part in these big numbers, there'd be no life. Okay? So let's give you a practical example what this might look like. Let's take, so according to science, the distance of the observable universe is about 20 billion light years. What's a light year? Anybody know what a light year is? What is it? The distance light will travel in 1 year. Anybody know what that equates to in miles? So 186,000 miles per second is the speed of light. But a light year, if you were to translate it into miles, is 5.88 trillion miles. Okay, so that's the distance that light travels in a year. Is 5.88 trillion miles. All right, so let's use this 20 billion light year across the universe. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this tape measure, we're going to stretch it all the way across the middle of the known universe, okay? 20 billion light years. And you fire a bullet. Let's say, I spin you around it and I say, okay, fire a bullet. And you fire it. That 1 in 10 to the 60 would be like hitting an inch mark on this tape measure. 1 in 10 to the 60 inches across the entire universe. In other words, if the universe came into being and the gravity had been slightly off by 1 inch on this ruler, there'd be no life. I mean, it's absolutely incredible the narrow range that gravity falls into. Okay. If the force of gravity had been too much, the universe would have collapsed back in on itself, or things couldn't have survived. But if it had been too little, the universe would have spread out too quickly, then nothing would have formed. Either way, no life would have been possible. Any questions? Okay. Again, you don't have to memorize this stuff, but we're going to go through it all. At the end, we'll kind of talk about, how do you, how would you use this? And then next week, we'll really get into how you would use it in a conversation. Okay. All right. So that's gravity. Let's look at the next one, the cosmological constant, which they mentioned. What is the cosmological constant? Well, it simply refers to how fast the universe is expanding. Remember we talked about Edwin Hubble and how he discovered the universe is expanding? This is telling us, the constant is telling us how fast it's expanding, okay? And if the speed of this constant was off by 1 part in 10 to the 120th, there'd be no life. How big is this number? That's how big that number is. 120 zeros after that 1. At a certain point, it's just, it begins to be so obvious that it's like, why are we even talking about this, right? But I promise you, people will still fight you on it, okay? So this is the rate at which the speed of the universe is expanding, okay? If it was off a little bit either way, either too fast or too slow, there'd be no life. Now, keep this in mind. This is just a reference point. Now, these numbers are they're not exact. They're what would you call it? What's that? They're theoretical and they're not exact. They're not precise, but they're approximate. Thank you. Approximate. 1 with 120 zeros after it. Scientists will say that there's only estimated to be about 10 to the 80th subatomic particles in the entire known universe. Now, you think about how small these particles are. There's only 10 to the 80th of them in the entire universe. This is way bigger than that. So the number is astronomical. To call it astronomical, actually, it would be an understatement. So that's the cosmological constant. And then lastly, we'll cover one more real quick because this one's even more impressive. Ratio, and I'm not gonna dive deep into what this means, but basically, the ratio of mass and energy in the early stages of the universe, if it was off by 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123, by 1 part in that, there'd be no life. Okay. How big is this number? That's how big that number is. That is 1,194 zeros. Okay. And you have, think about this, you have scientists who are atheists who are saying that these are some of the odds that you'd have life in this universe. Yes, Annie.
I just thought something that's interesting is that the odds of Jesus fulfilling just eight specific prophecies that he did is 1 to 1 to the 17. But all the prophecies he fulfilled, the odds were 1 and 100. I'm doing it fast.
I've heard something like that myself too. And so, yeah. Well, and you just start adding all these things. You don't need to add them all together, but it just makes the case even stronger, right? Um, so thank you for sharing that. So we're, in a nutshell, we're talking about numbers that are so big that there's no reasonable way to say it happened by chance. That's where we're going to get to. Okay. Um, Now in the video, there were some people that were quoted saying certain things, and I just want to run briefly through who these people are because somebody might think, oh well, those guys are Christians. Those are Christians saying this stuff. Well, they're not. The first one in your notes, Sir Martin Rees. He was an agnostic. Remember what agnostic means? It doesn't necessarily say there is a God, but he's not against it, right? Okay. A renowned British astrophysicist and cosmologist, former president of the Royal Society of Master of Trinity College, a leading expert on black holes, galaxy formation, and the multiverse. And he said, wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine tuning. Okay. So not a Christian. Now we have somebody that you probably are familiar with. You guys know who Stephen Hawking was? Okay. He, at least for most of his life, I'm not sure about at the end of his life, but he would have said he's an atheist. He would have made the claim, no, there's no God. And yet, he said this, the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. So when you have atheists saying these things, doesn't that make the argument even more powerful? That's what we're getting at here. Okay. Lastly, this guy, I didn't know who he was, but he's an atheist, again, British physicist, is all in your notes, a major proponent of the multiverse, which we'll get into a little bit. And he said, if anyone claims to not be surprised at the special features of the universe, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. So with the atheists and the agnostics, not just atheists and agnostic, but some of the leading people in the scientific field are saying these things is very powerful. And so, you could use that in a conversation and say, well, Stephen Hawking, Sir Martin Rees, these guys were not believers and they're admitting that it's fine-tuned, and that's real simple to memorize. So now we got to ask ourselves, what's the best explanation of the fine-tuning? Okay, remember we said the fine-tuning is like all the dials are set just right, but what's the best explanation? Well, that's when we get to premise 2. So premise 1, we confirm premise 1. You just have to look at the numbers that the universe is fine-tuned. Now we want to defend this. The universe, the fine-tuning is due to necessity, chance, or design, meaning that there are only 3 live options that we can talk about. There might be more, but I've never heard of any. That the universe has to be this way, that it just so happened to be this way by chance, or that it was purposely designed this way. Those are the 3 options. And these seem to be the only possible reasons. So what is necessity? What does that mean? So it means that the universe has to be life permitting, that the constants and quantities that, are so astronomically rare could not have been any other way. And in the video, it talked about how there's no evidence for that. There's no reason to believe that in fact, it's much more likely that, if you take this, if you say, okay, let's pretend that the universe just popped into existence. Let's just pretend that those numbers could have been any which way. There's no reason why they had to be this way. Okay. So we don't think it's not due to necessity. So I'm saying it was due to chance. Did we just get really, really, really lucky? Well, we'll see. We'll go through some odds again later, but just from the numbers, you can see that there's no way. There's no way we got that lucky. And then so lastly would be design. That someone designed it this way. Someone designed it this way, not something, because something can't do anything. Someone has to design. Okay. So that was premise 2. We just showed that, there's 3 possibilities. That's all premise 2 is. Now, premise 3, we get a little bit more into it, and we're going to show why it's not due to these 2, chance or necessity. How do we know it's not due to chance or necessity? Why not? Why not? Again, these constants are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no evidence or reason to think that these are necessary. It's pretty straightforward. Rarely anybody argues that it's necessary. You might find a few, but it's really not debated that much. Most people, if they don't believe in design, will say they have it by chance. Okay. The chance of all these constants and quantities that they would be so precise is beyond reasonable to believe. Again, about the numbers, even just one constant is impossible, but you have to have them all be the right numbers. Okay. This leads to the next point, and in the next part of your pamphlet there. Go to the multiverse paper. Okay. Because, okay, so this is what I want you to understand. Because think of yourself as this scientist. You're going, okay, I see the universe is fine-tuned, extremely fine-tuned, but I'm not ready to say it's God. I'm not ready to say this a design. So I have to posit some other theory, and that's what this is. This would be the scientist or the atheist scientist theory of how it happened, and I'll explain what this is. So, what is the multiverse theory? What is it that they're saying here? So the idea is that we live. I wish I was going to bring a drawing board. That's fine though. We live in this, let's say, this bubble of a universe. Okay, this universe is our universe. We're here, and it's life permitting. The multiverse theory would say, well, there's another universe over here, and another one here, and another one here, and another one here. Trillions of them, right? They would say that all these universes, there's trillions. Some would say there's an infinite amount of universes out there outside of ours. Okay. And they would say that each of those universes have their own values. So some universes, gravity is stronger than ours. Some universes, gravity is weaker than ours. Some universes, the expansion rate is faster, and on and on and on. And some believe it to be trillions and trillions. Some believe it to be infinite amount. Okay, that's the idea. Does anybody understand that concept? Like there's more than one? Okay.
But it's written.
No, and we'll get to that. So why does this theory exist? Why is it even talked about? Well, simply because the fine-tuning of the universe appears to be so incredible. This would not be a theory taken seriously by anybody if we did not discover the fine-tuning. There'd be no reason to even suggest this. However, the constants we talked about are so dialed in, so precise, that in order for an atheist to in order for the atheist to avoid the conclusion that it was designed, they'll say, well, there must be an infinite amount of other universes, and we just so happen to live in the one that permits life.
That's interesting. You were just talking about how if it was given one off, or wouldn't be able to just inherently those can't just because they operate.
Actually, no, that's good, but I'll explain why that's not entirely correct. So the constants and quantities have to be a certain way in order to allow life to exist, not necessarily things. Now someone could argue, well, yeah, chemistry too, but the point though is that theoretically, again, you could have a universe outside of ours, theoretically, that has different values and still exist as a universe, but will not allow life. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Where are we at? Okay. So in order to avoid the conclusion that our universe must be designed, they'll say, well, there must be an infinite amount of universes out there, all having their own different values, and we just happen to live in the universe that permits life. Because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here to talk about it, right? Okay. And in order to do this, scientists have to postulate, and they talked about in the video, some kind of universe generating mechanism. I mean, because otherwise you're sitting there and you go, well, where do they come from? That's something that has to generate them. So they have to postulate that. Another thing with no evidence. And so the idea is that eventually, whatever mechanism produces all these universes, eventually it'll spit one out that can allow life. That's the theory. And we just happen to be in that universe. Okay? But let me give you an example of this. Let's say, anybody ever play 5-card draw or Texas Hold'em or anything like poker? Used to play that when I was a kid. It's like my grandma. If I sat down with you and I played a game of 5-card draw, and I said it was my first and only time playing this game, and I'm dealing and we're playing, and I get a royal flush in the first hand, would that be surprising? Yeah, in fact, beginner's luck, right? It could be. Even though the odds of that are 1 in 649,000. However, let's say, okay, beginner's luck. Okay. Then we deal another hand, and I get another royal flush. Now what do you say? Exactly. And let's say I continue on to get 3, 4, 5 in a row. By the second one, you know I'm cheating. Why? Because the odds just get more and more intense the more you go in a row. Then you get shot. That's right. The pit bosses come out of the casino and you get thrown out. So if I got 5 royal flushes in a row, the best explanation would be that I'm cheating, that it was a put-up job. Okay? Now, the theory, though, of the multiverse, as an example, would be this. It would be like, okay, if you play poker enough times, right? I know it's 1 in 650,000, but if you played 650 billion times, eventually you're going to get a royal flush, right? And that's true. However, that assumes that we got more than one shot at it, right? So when it comes to the universe, they would say, well, okay, so it would pop out a universe. Okay, that one doesn't permit life. Okay, it's really rare. But by the 400 trillionth one, oh, we got a life permitting universe. That's kind of the idea, right? So if you play enough times, eventually you get the royal flush. And this is essentially why the theory exists, is that if the universe had one shot to exist and it was so fine-tuned, it would be like, well, it's designed that way. But if you go, well, wait a minute, but there's all these other universes out there that don't have life, then you start to try to get rid of the need for a designer. Okay. And I love this. This is actually a backhanded compliment for the Christian worldview, because of the lengths people are going through to try to avoid design. This is real. I'm not making this stuff up. This is the only reason why the theory exists, because the fine-tuning is so powerful. In fact, this argument seems to be the most powerful among the most secular atheists. Okay. So and this is to your comment earlier, Dow, what is the problem with this theory? Well, there's no proof, right? It's not empirical science. Empirical means you can touch it, you can smell it, you can taste it. It means you can use your 5 senses. It's not empirically verified. It's purely speculative. If it can't be seen, you can't see it, you can't detect it in any way. There's literally no observable evidence that a multiverse exists. It is simply an assertion that is made in order to avoid the conclusion that the universe was designed. If you can understand this theory and understand why it exists, it's extremely powerful. Okay. Also, remember I talked about that universe generating mechanism. In the video, they had this little drawing of it, you know, and they said, but even if that were the case, the machine that generates the universes would have to be finely tuned. So you're just pushing the problem another step back, even if the multiverse did exist. Okay. And I thought of an analogy, like, why would the machine need to be finely tuned? Well, imagine a machine that builds computers, but it builds them in a way where they're not all functional. This kind of like, it's spitting out this stuff, but eventually, 1 in a billion, it spits out a computer that works. Well, in order to generate computers, and eventually when that works, the thing had to have been put together and assembled, and it would have had to have been specially made. Like it has to have functionality. So in the same way, whatever's generating these universes would have to be finely tuned. So it doesn't really solve the problem anyways. Now, we're going to touch briefly on this. This might get a little deep, and we don't have to spend too much time on it. But the point in the video right here, this was a point in the video where they talked about small patches of order versus large patches. What does that mean? Well, this comes from something called the Boltzmann brain. That's why they have this brain here. And what this is, it's hypothetical. Okay. It's saying basically in so many words, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but in so many words, it's saying that if a universe could pop into being, if a life-permitting universe could pop into being, it's much more likely that that universe wouldn't be so large and complex, but rather simple enough to just accommodate one single person, even a person imagining they're in a universe. And here's an example that might make it make sense. If I have a paint set, right? I'm painting, and then I walk past it and I bump it and it falls off the table, and I look and I go, wow, isn't that fascinating? And I see it made like an image. What's more likely, that it made the image of a smiley face, like distorted smiley face? You can be like, that kind of looks like a smiley face. Or would it be more likely that spilling that paint generated an exact replica of the Mona Lisa? That's the point, is that if it could happen, if it could just pop into existence, it shouldn't be so complex. It should just be very simple, right? Like that smiley face. And that's called the Boltzmann brain, that a brain fluctuating into existence is more likely than what we see here. So in the same way, it would be far more likely that by chance, a much simpler universe would be the result. However, what we observe is the last thing we should expect, and that is a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, it wouldn't be able to explain how complex the universe is. Okay, that's...
People who are set electric, they said, what are they doing? They got to see the way. What are some? They say, why would they? How would they care?
Yeah. Right. I think what it comes down to is that in their minds, they're coming from a philosophical presupposition that it cannot be God. It has to be something else. That's their presupposition. If you rule that out, though, then you're forced to deal with stuff like this. How else would you explain it? It's the presuppositions they have that don't allow them to explore better options. I believe. At least that's what I've seen, because it does seem so ridiculous. But if you're so compelled to believe, let's say nothing could convince me that, let's say, I don't know, my son committed a crime, and nothing could convince me. So I'm going to postulate anything else that might explain it, because it's more emotional, it's more volitional. And so when you get a person like that is so um, fixated on there being no God for whatever reason, there's no other options, right? And so you're going to have to lie to yourself, convince yourself somehow. That makes sense? Yeah. Andy, did you have a question?
Well, I was gonna say when I
You said, "How dare you?" Which it kind of reminds me of the attitude, like, this is what it is, and I'm not open minded because there can be no God. So it's almost like the same thing with evolution. For an atheist, the evolution is the only game in town because they don't believe in God, so they have to believe something else that explains life, right? So why do they believe in evolution, even though there's a lot of evidence against it? Because there's no other option for them. They have to if they're gonna maintain there's no God. Did you want to?
So what does that make? Why does that make it?
It doesn't make it any better. Well, I think they're searching for anything that could possibly show that we don't need God.
Yeah, far off.
It is. I think so. So let's say I think the most common reason is probably moral reasons. They don't want a God to exist because of moral accountability or whatever reason they have. It's strong enough to believe anything else. I mean, let's face it, we'll lie to ourselves if we really want to believe things. And so, um, but here's the thing. I know it's hard and it's hard to put yourself in their shoes. You have to empathize, even though it doesn't make any sense. If you're in a conversation and you're like, well, that's stupid. You shouldn't believe that. That's not going to work. You have to be like, oh, okay. Help me understand why you believe that. Okay. And you know what I mean? Like, so even though it's hard, you have to kind of control your temperament.
Look at how many civilizations leave it idols.
Hmm. Yeah. I don't either. That's why you ask them.
That's why I do ask them, but they never have an answer.
Well, and that's
And if they don't have an answer, they usually get mad.
right. And so that's another point to be made is,
They don't want to discuss it.
yeah. And that's okay. So, but that's good that you bring it up because if no one ever challenged him on it, and they probably never thought about it, maybe by you saying, "Well, have you ever considered this?" Even if they get upset, maybe they'll be mad for a little bit, but maybe later when they're alone, they'll start thinking about it.
Oh, eating it.
Right. It happens. Absolutely. So yeah, now we're trying to talk about like the psychology of why people, but there's a lot there. That's why we got to be patient with people. Okay. Um, okay, where are we at here? Okay, so let's use one quick analogy here. The lottery analogy. It's the lottery. I don't know, Powerball, whatever you want to call it. So let's pretend there is a vat of these balls, and they're all white except for one. But there's let's say 100 trillion balls at the same amount of the number of cells in your body. 100 trillion balls, and only one of them is black, right? And I say, okay, you got one shot, not two, not 10, not 1,000, not a trillion. You get one shot at drawing the black ball without looking, right? That's what it's like to say the universe just happens to be life permitting. Now, the multiverse would say, well, you have many chances. You can grab as many times as you want. That's kind of what it's saying. But again, we have no evidence for that. The evidence shows we only did have one shot, and that was this universe, and it's life permitting. Actually, it's worse than the example I gave because the example I gave was 100 trillion. We're talking about numbers way beyond that. So do you see how desperate that attempt is? That desperate attempt to say, oh, there must be a multiverse is very desperate. It's very telling. So our last option is design. So we showed premise 3 that so that not that chance isn't, remember we said possible versus probable. You could say, well, technically it's possible, Jesse. We're not talking about possible. We're talking about plausible. It's not plausible that it happened by chance or necessity. Okay. Therefore, the conclusion follows that the fine-tuning of the universe is due to design. Okay. That's the best explanation. Again, A couple more quotes. Sir Fred Hoyle, who was an atheist, again, which is smart, right? They're using atheist quotes. That's smart. A prominent British astrophysicist who developed this theory of stellar nuclear whatever. He said a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. So back to your question and your question, Keith, is that so then if he's saying this, if an atheist is saying this, what does he believe really? Well, I don't know, but a lot of people might just be, I just don't know. Kind of like they take a default agnostic view. They're not going to make the claim it was God. They're not going to make the claim it was a designer. But they're also not going to make the claim it was chance either. They're just going to stay agnostic about it so they don't have the burden of proof. Remember? We talked about that? Which I guess that's the way to go about it, but you're not really saying much at that point. And then the last one was Paul Davies. Now, he is the only one that was not Christian, but he was agnostic, but he would kind of consider himself a little spiritual. Definitely not Christian. Again, famous cosmologist, physicist, he said, "This is for me powerful evidence that there's something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming." Again, not a believer. And then you say, does this fit with Scripture? Remember we talked about the cosmological argument. Does that fit with Scripture? I believe it does. We shared a verse, and we'll share this verse. Psalms 19, 1-2. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. Written long, long time ago. So, the conclusion then is this. That the universe, the fine-tuning is due to design. But what does this imply? Remember the last argument, the conclusion was something like the universe began to exist. And then we go, well, what does that imply? And then we go, get spaceless, timeless, immaterial, personal, powerful creator, right? Well, what does this imply? It simply implies that there's a designer. That's it. Okay? If we show, which I believe we just did, that the universe came about by design, it means there was a designer. That makes sense? Okay. But a designer implies a designer, right? So this person is designing clothes or whatever. A designer implies a personal being, right? Okay. Now, does this necessarily imply that God exists? Not necessarily. But it certainly moves it certainly narrows the bullseye. Now, when I say not necessarily, I mean like one might make this argument, which is ridiculous, but this has been made. Richard Dawkins, I don't know if you've ever seen this documentary. It's called Expelled. It came out like 15 years ago. It's really interesting. But Ben Stein is going around, and it's more about evolution, but going to college campuses and asking, why can't we talk about design? Why does it always have to be evolution? And he interviews Richard Dawkins at the end, who says something like, well, I know it appears to be designed, but it's not. But if it was designed, perhaps aliens did it. No, to be fair, I don't think he believes in aliens. He's trying to postulate an explanation. However, he does realize, thankfully, that you're just pushing the problem one step back. Even if aliens happen to, let's say they seeded the universe from another universe, where did the aliens come from? So you're just pushing the problem back. You don't get to an unmoved mover or an uncreated creator, right? And so remember, this is a cumulative case we're making. So each argument shows different things. The cosmological argument shows that using logic and science and philosophy, that the universe came into being and the best explanation is a being like God. This argument is showing that being also is a designer. And then the next one will show the moral attributes. But so this is a cumulative case. It's one piece in the puzzle. And I would never say, again, that you would go through what I just went through with you in a conversation. However, when things start getting mentioned about the multiverse and about this and that, you might remember, oh, yeah, however, that doesn't make sense because of this. So we're just going through all of it for you. So we're making a cumulative case. Any questions? We're going to summarize what we learned. And we're getting through this a little quickly, but that's okay because we have time to talk about what we'll do next week too. But any questions so far? Okay. So the summary of this, again, when we go back to it, premise one: the universe is fine-tuned to allow life to occur. This is uncontroversial in modern science. Okay? It's uncontroversial, that first premise. Premise two: the fine-tuning of the universe is either due to necessity, chance, or design. These seem to be the only options we have for an explanation. Premise three: the fine-tuning is not due to necessity or chance. Why? Because there's no evidence it's necessary, and chance is way too implausible. And then the conclusion is, therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to design, which implies a designer, and a designer implies a personal being. However you want to phrase that, a lot of people will take an argument like this and they'll put it in their own words. That's totally fine. I'm just telling you, this is the kind of the formal argument. All right. Before we get into some other stuff, let's just do this. Let's just do this quiz here. Again, we're gonna do it kind of the same way. You want to pass it around? Kind of the same way we did with the first argument. We'll do a quiz now. We'll recap next week. Maybe we'll do another game so that we can help as a memorization tool. Okay. All right. All the answers are in your notes, and you can shout it out if you got an answer. Raise your hand or whatever you want to do. So the word teleological is comprised of two words, telos and logical. What does telos mean? End, goal, purpose, or completion. Okay. So what does it mean when scientists say the universe is fine-tuned?
Big. Don't change those.
Okay, good. Otherwise it won't work. You can think about probably a lot of things that they're like a car engine, computer, carburetor. That's right. Computer software, you got this, what you get something off, it doesn't run. Okay, very good. And I just want to say real quick, again, when they say fine-tuned, they don't necessarily mean design. They just mean that all those dials are very precisely set, and then they go, okay, why is that? Okay. What's the difference between something that is possible and something that is plausible? Someone else. George, do you know?
Possible is yes, it could happen.
Technically.
Probable, not.
Or plausible. Not so right. So something could be technically possible, like I could have got here in a jet, but it's not plausible, right? Yeah. Someday, maybe. Yeah. Got to get the church giving up. Just kidding. Okay. So anybody, you can look if you want, but if you don't have to look, great. I expect you probably should if you need to. But what is the entire teleological argument? What does it say? I should probably get off that screen. Anyone know premise one? Sorry, say it again. Diane? The universe is fine-tuned to allow life to occur. That's premise one. Premise two? Shout it out. Not exactly. I mean, yeah, it's in your notes, so if you can find it. Premise two of the teleological argument says, it might be on page 1 or 2. On 2. Yep. Can you say it again? Sorry.
Either due
Beats. Either due to necessity, chance, or design. Very good. Premise 3. Nope. Read it from your notes. That's okay. Premise 3 is what? It's not. It's not due to necessity or chance. And then the conclusion is what? Therefore, that must be design. Very good. All right. Number 5 is fill in the blank. If the force of gravity had been altered in one part to blank, life in the universe would not be possible. Again, it's in your notes. 10 to the 60th power. Remember what we said too, 10 to the 60th power is like stretching a tape ruler across the entire known universe. And hitting an inch mark. Oh, very, very implausible. Okay, I can help you with this one if you can't find it, but what does the cosmological constant describe? So we talked about the cosmological constant, similar to gravity, but it's 1 part in 10 to the 120. What is that constant? What is it measuring? Do you remember? Very good. Very good. The rate of the expansion of the universe. So how fast it's expanding. And if we're off any slower, any faster by 1 part in 10 to the 120, life wouldn't be possible. All right. Out of the people that we quoted, who was the one that said this? The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Again, it's in your notes. Stephen Hawking. Good job. Number 8, can anyone explain what necessity means in this argument? When someone would say, if someone said, well, I think the universe is necessarily fine-tuned, what does that mean? What are they trying to say? They're not attributing it to chance. They're not attributing it to design. They're saying it's necessary. What does that mean, though? Okay. But why is there order? They would say, well, necessarily those are order. But what do you mean by that? Not quite. So what they would mean by that is that it had to be this way. It couldn't have been any other way. Like all those numbers we talked about, the 10 to the 60th for gravity, the cosmos, like there's no possible way it could have been otherwise, is what they would say. But again, we have no reasons to believe that. We have no evidence for that. It's actually a pretty crazy claim if you think about it. All right. In a nutshell, if you could, what is the multiverse theory? What is it stating? Diane, did you say that? Yep. Yeah. That would be the theory. And we showed why that's even a theory is because they're trying to find an escape route, basically. But 2, there's no evidence for it, like we said. But you're right. That's the theory that there's either a lot of universes or an infinite amount. But either way, that's the theory. And so what are some problems with I think we just kind of touched on it. What are some problems with this multiverse theory? I think I just said it, but what are some problems with this multiverse theory that no empirical science to back it up? Yep. Very good. All right. 2 more, and then we'll touch on something briefly, and then we can get to any questions. But if the universe was designed, what does that imply? That's very good. There was a designer, but she didn't just stop there. She goes, and it had to be a person, just like you were saying too. Good job. So it implies that there was a designer, and that designer has to be a personal being. Or you could say creator. And keep this in mind that the words I'm using are not hard and fast. If you find a better word to use that's better for you, use it. Okay? So if you want to say personal, designer, or creator, that's fine. And lastly, what does Psalm 19:1-2 say? Very good. So just some biblical support for the argument, right? And again, I want to just touch on this real quick again. I know I said it before. If you don't understand or don't agree, that's fine. You could just not use this argument, because there are arguments that I've learned that I don't quite get or quite agree with. I don't use them. That's fine. Totally fine. Or if you don't believe that God created the universe this way, that's fine too. But just keep in mind, for somebody that does believe this is how the universe came to be, it's very powerful for them. And you can show them that the best explanation for their view is a designer. So even if you don't buy it, it could be very helpful for them. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions? I love that. How is that reasonable? Right? Like, I love that you asked that. So there are two things that I can think of that some people, I would agree with one of them, but there are two things that I can think of that have been talked about that must be necessary. In other words, there's no possible reality where these things couldn't exist. One is God. God would be considered a necessary being, that there is no possible reality that could exist without God. And two are numbers. Some people would argue that numbers are necessary. Why? Well, because if you have a reality with anything in it, even one thing, you have numbers. You have a rock, or you have a chair. So, and now I'm not saying I buy that. I'm not saying I believe numbers are necessary, but I'm saying that that is an option that people might go to. So there could be these metaphysical things or abstract things that you could consider necessary. Like, there's no possible way they could not exist. Now, I think that when you start applying that to these numbers, that just completely deflates. There's no reason to think that about these numbers. And the reason why is because the laws of nature don't determine these numbers. So here's an analogy. So if you were to accept the Big Bang Theory, this is what they'd say, that, there was nothing, no space, matter, and time. And then there was an explosion. It's not technically right, but let's just say an explosion. And at some point between the beginning and between that there was all that mass and energy broke apart into different quantities. And that it was almost like, if I flip a table over, whatever lands kind of a thing. And so they say that in the same way, these constants just popped out. Now, again, you'd have to say it was either necessary, it was just happened to be, or it was designed that way. I can't remember why it was, but anyways, so that's kind of like, if you had to picture it in your head, that's how I would describe it, is that there was a point in time in the early universe where these things just kind of fell out. Make sense? And if something falls out like that, the best explanation, it was on purpose, right? Okay. I want to touch on one more thing real quick, because we got a little bit of time. And next week we'll get more into depth. So next week, again, we'll do the recap. We'll have fun. Get you some prizes again. We'll just be relaxed, but it'll help you memorize some of the stuff. But one of the objections that gets brought up is, okay, let's say I agree with you. Let's say, Jesse, you made a good case. It has to be a designer. But who designed the designer then? As if asking that question nullifies everything we went through. It doesn't. Here's a way to respond to that. One, you could respond to kind of the same way we did with the cosmological. You could say, well, the buck has to stop somewhere. You have to have some kind of cause that's not cause. Otherwise, you deal with that infinite regress of causes, right? What caused that? What caused that? What caused that? On into infinity. However, there's a better way to answer it, I think, for this, is that one example would be, let's say we went back to the moon or whatever, but this time we went to the dark side of the moon. And let's say astronauts, for example, let's say they discovered these towers and all this machinery and these complex things, and let's say they discovered all this machinery on the dark side of the moon. The best explanation would be that some intelligence put it there, right? You wouldn't say that it just randomly happened. But you don't need an explanation of the explanation to know the best explanation. In other words, in order to know the best explanation, you don't need an explanation of the explanation. If you say the best explanation is aliens, that's still the best explanation, even if you don't know how the aliens got there. Doesn't matter. So this almost like a mental trick, and I don't think they realize they're doing it, but there might be sincere, but like, oh yeah, well, who designed the designer then? As if that just throws out the argument. It doesn't. You don't need an explanation of an explanation in order to know that that explanation is the best. Right. I think one video shared it this way. If the universe, as we know it, were shrunk down to the size of a basketball, and this universe basketball thing, we're lying on the ground, and then you're walking in the woods, and you stumble across this orb, and you're looking like, wow, that's cool. You'd wonder why it's there. You'd say it has a reason why it's there. Well, why would that not need a reason? Why would that need a reason, but the universe doesn't? Like, doesn't matter the size. If something exists, it needs a reason why it exists. And briefly, we're not going to go into depth with this. We got 15, maybe 10 minutes, I'll go. But this also applies to human beings. So in our last class, we went pretty in depth into the human DNA. The human DNA is a strand of information, okay? And each one of your cells is a strand of DNA, and it has 3.4 billion characters. Billion. So just like our alphabet has 26 characters, or sorry, that's not the right way to think about it. So it's a 4-character alphabet. Okay, that's what it is. So our alphabet's a 26-character alphabet. The DNA is a 4-character alphabet. In other words, there's 4 different molecules, and depending on how you arrange them, you get different things. You get a George or a Kelly, or you get Diane, you get Dow, or at least the body. And so the reason why when you're in the mother's womb and your body forms the way it does is because the DNA tells it how to form, okay? That's information. Information only comes from minds, okay? So this would be like an argument against evolution, but information only comes from minds, and that's why I brought up the cereal box analogy. If the one that Frank Turek in the book gives is that if I tipped it over and the alphabet cereal on the floor said, "Take out the garbage, Mom," it's like, if I walked into a room and it said, "Take out the garbage, Mom," in alphabet cereal, I wouldn't assume the cat knocked the box over. I would assume that my mom left me a note, right? But we're talking about what, 12 to 14 characters long? Now take that and go 3.4 billion characters long. Something so complex it produces you and me, at least physically, right? Again, when you see things like this, it always points back to a design, which points back to a mind. Okay. So you can make the case from like we did here about the initial conditions. You could make a case from, I don't think it's as powerful simply because this one goes right to the beginning, but you could make a case for like the solar system. So the moon has to be here in order for us to be in the right rotation, or us to have tides. Actually, Jupiter, they say, needs to be in our solar system. Why? Because Jupiter's so big, it's like a cosmic vacuum. It attracts all the space junk, all the the big stuff that if it hit us would be catastrophic. Then there's other things like that. The distance from the sun, like we're in the Goldilocks zone. Or you could argue about what I just said, like that we as human beings have DNA, and DNA is complex information. It's almost like software code, but instead of software code where it's like ones and zeros, it's a 4-letter alphabet. So, in fact, Bill Gates, I don't have the quote, but Bill Gates even was saying that the human DNA is just like software code, except much more complex. So you could go at it any different way. I chose this way because this, again, goes back to the very beginning. But yeah, you could tackle this different ways. So next week, again, we'll quickly recap this. We'll play a game, and then we'll go into some objections. We'll go into how do I actually use this in a conversation, because it's one thing to go through all this and try to absorb it, because I know it's a lot. It's another thing to go, okay, well, how am I supposed to use this practically, right? So we'll do that. That way, the stuff's ingrained in your mind, and we can kind of talk about how, and we might do a little role play. And then that'll be it for this argument. After that, I believe it's in the syllabus or the curriculum that it's tactics, which I'm looking forward to, because this is, again, if you don't have the book, you can get it, or we'll get it for you. But these are the things that are really wise to do in conversations. One of the things that I talked to Annie about in that conversation with your friend is that ask questions, and that's one of the tactics we'll talk about. So, yeah, hopefully you guys took away something from this. Again, we'll recap next week, but I that's kind of all I had for tonight. Anything else you guys want to add or talk about? I don't know if you guys are on Facebook or anything. I have a messenger group with some of the people here, but otherwise I'll send out emails. But yeah, if, we could do a sign up sheet, or maybe we can decide right now, like who wants to help next week. Does you want to do that? Does anybody feel like bringing something next week? It doesn't have to just be one person. I think
Doesn't matter. I do any stuff.
you want to. Okay. Why don't are you guys able to get a hold of me? Like, do you have my number, or email, or should I give it to you? I'll give it to you. That way, I'll kind of know what you're bringing, so someone doesn't bring the same thing. So I'll get you that. But all right, that's it then. Thank you for the food. Thank you for coming. I'm really excited to see you guys coming back because I know my biggest fear was like, okay, they're gonna get scared off. But I hope you guys realize that this is just part of a long process of learning things that we might not know that might help. And so I think it's a very valuable thing. Anybody want to close us in prayer? Keith? Great.
Just first thing,